All right, well, welcome, everyone. It's good to see you. My name is Sheila Jellin, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the director of the Jewish Studies program here at the University of Kentucky and a professor of Hebrew and Jewish Studies in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second lecture in the University of Kentucky Spring 2024 lecture series, Jewish Ukraine. Sasha Senderovich will be speaking on how the Soviet Jew was made, which is also the title of his recent book. And I just wanted to begin by sharing a little vignette that I actually shared with Sasha on the way here. I grew up in Chicago in the 1970s and the 1980s, and Soviet Jewry was a big issue. It was something that brought the community together. It was probably second only to Israel. To issues surrounding Zionism in Israel during those years. We were well versed on the situation of refuseniks or Soviet Jews who sought to leave the Soviet Union in order to practice Judaism without fear of imprisonment or recrimination. And I remember as a child going to Save Soviet Jewry rallies, and my mother worked on behalf specifically of someone named Vladimir, whose wife Esther, my mother met in Israel. She had gotten permission to go to Israel with her son, Rafi, who was disabled, and her husband, Vladimir, wasn't allowed to leave the Soviet Union. And so my mother, for years and years as a writer, worked on behalf of Vladimir, and ultimately he did get out, and he did go to Israel. Every year in the Orthodox Jewish Day School that I attended in Chicago, there was always a new child from the Soviet Union, just one child, dressed in hand-me-downs and looking very frightened because we were kind of tough in our school, and we've been together since birth, basically. They didn't usually last long in the school, and they were usually replaced the following year by someone else in hand-me-downs who was looking scared and then was going to leave in another year. So when I conceived of the lecture series this semester, I was responding to the ongoing war in Ukraine and my own experience as a scholar of Hebrew literature, for whom many of the places that have been in the news are familiar, because at the turn of the 20th century, they were the sites of the birth of Hebrew literature, of a modern Hebrew literature. So I wanted to illuminate the Jewishness of many of the places that we've been hearing about in the news, both past as well as present. And I can think of no one better I couldn't think of anyone better to invite than Dr. Senderovich, whose book I was in the process of reading. So not only did his invitation sort of come after the conception, I actually think that reading his book inspired me to sort of organize this. So Sasha Senderovich is Associate Professor of Slavic, Jewish, and International Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. He is the author of How the Soviet Jew Was Made. We have copies that people can acquire here if they would like. I think Sasha will tell us more about how to acquire them, right? The book was a finalist for the 2023 National Jewish Book Award. It was shortlisted for the 2024 AATSEEL. I don't know what that stands for.
So American Association of Teachers of Slavic and East European Language.
Okay, thank you. That's the first
It's
book
a mouthful.
award.
I know, it's a mouthful, yeah.
With Harriet Murav, he translated the Yiddish writer David Bergelson's novel Judgment through Northwestern University Press in 2017. His and Harriet Murav's current translation project, In the Shadow of the Holocaust, short fiction by Jewish writers from the Soviet Union, has received funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and is expected from Stanford University Press in 2026. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Senderovich.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the introduction. I didn't catch your name, the person who is doing tech, but thank you for setting up a complicated situation where you should ignore this side of the screen because this is for me to know what comes next, but it's set up this way for Zoom, people on Zoom. And thank you so much to Sheila Jellin for the invitation and also for to Melissa Miller for planning all of the details, and also had a wonderful day meeting new colleagues today. So thank you so much to Karen Petrone, and to Melissa Blazing, and to Raymond DeLuca for the coffees, the lunch, and the bourbon that I have imbibed before coming here to give this talk this evening, which I guess is what one does when one is in Kentucky. So I'll can people hear? This is fine. Do I need to use this is too, like, I'll be like not seeing people. That's kind of this thing. I'm going to do this sort of, I need to switch the slides for people on Zoom. It might not be as eloquent, but hopefully we can manage. While on book tour with Molly, after a drink and then sampling more, the story came up that had to do with something that our book tour, not book tour, our bourbon tour leader had talked about reading books in his hot tub. So I brought up the story after drinking that the very first public appearance of my book out there in the world, before any reviews were in this random tweet. This is real. This is from the summer of 2022. You can't see the bottom of it. July 2022. The book came out in July 2022. Some random person who I'd never heard of and then had contacted had tweeted this. So he is at Bathman, a bathtub reading. He's on Twitter, calls himself the Bathman, and posts photos of himself in his bathtub with this elaborate, Batman getup, reading various books, and has very eclectic taste. So I have no idea how Bathman had found a copy of my book, but Molly encouraged me to put this into the talk, so I wanted to start there. There are 4 copies of the book. One was already claimed for if people want to get them. I paid for them with my author discount, so I paid $27 for them. You could have it for that, or you could have it for less. If you want to have it for free, ask me. I don't want to take them back to Seattle. So there are 4 of them still here that I'm happy to get rid of after the talk. When one writes a book about the sort of Soviet subject, one is often steered into a cover that looks like this. If you've written a book about a Soviet subject, usually there's red and black are the default colors. And the press first wanted to have a cover that you see on the right, or I guess it's the left if you're looking at it this way, with kind of the title of the book very clearly in a kind of a red banner. If you're in the field, you will be able to kind of place that very clearly in a certain sort of way of thinking about the Soviet Union. And it's sort of funny, but also it kind of it became, I did not have such a cover. So my book has a more kind of subtle, they still needed red. So there's a little bit of coloring that makes you think of Schindler's List, which is not quite the right idea here either. And I'll talk more about this image later at the end of the talk, because the image is also really interesting. It sort of became interesting to me kind of at the point of book production to think about how people might sort of come to the title, perceive the title. So Sheila's story from the beginning about kind of the point of encounter that many Jews in the US had with the notion of Soviet Jews comes from the Soviet Jewry movement of the Cold War. And I think in this book, I'm trying to write something like a prehistory of this, right? So I'm trying to write about kind of rewind, go back before the term had that particular association, and to try to sort of think about it at a different time and place. So this is a talk in a series on Jewish Ukraine, which, thank you for the invitation also that my book somehow played a role in conceiving the series. I'm not a Ukrainianist, right? So I have to kind of first start with this, as Tevi Yildirim starts with Katonsi, right? I'm not worthy. But what happened was that once the book came out, I realized that so much of it was about Ukraine, and that some of Ukrainianists actually thought of the book as helpful to them. So I probably would have not agreed to come had it not been for a year ago. I was invited by Matthew Pauly at Michigan State to give a talk there, and it was in a Yiddish series, but he's a Ukrainianist and a Ukrainian historian who was really sort of interested in kind of having my book as something to think about, and he kind of gave me some ideas about why it may be actually unwittingly I had sort of written something that would be of use. So I'll try to pull out some of the things that are about Ukraine, but there's something else that I also do in the book that I'll talk about. So I wanted to start in Ukraine, in Odessa, and start with Isaac Babel. Isaac Babel, who was a Russian language writer he was from Mykolaiv, but he was raised in Odessa, and wrote extensively about Odessa in Russian. He has a story from the 1930s called The End of the Almshouse, or The End of the Poorhouse, Konец Bогодевни. And a poorhouse, in this case, almshouse, is a Jewish communal institution that, sort of built by money of kind of local philanthropists to house the elderly, the kind of indigent elderly. And this poorhouse is located just outside one of the cemeteries in Odessa. So in the story, the quote is from the very end of the story. These elderly Jews who have been living in this poorhouse by the cemetery are expelled from the poorhouse by the cemetery. This is 1919. The kind of revolutionary forces are in town. And the very last image of the story is these people walking away from the poorhouse. So the heap tormented the heap of rags, gruda lachmotiev in Russian, that was dragging itself across the earth. Their road lay, or a journey, you could translate that title differently, and from Russian that becomes more interesting if you think about it as a journey. It lay along a joyless, scorched and stony highway past waterland-built shanties, past fields choked by stones, past burned-out houses, past the plague hill. Once upon a time in Odessa, this inexpressibly melancholy road had led from the town to the cemetery. The spelling is with two S's because I'm taking this from an existing English language translation. Remember whose? My apologies. So I was really drawn to this image of what does it mean for the Soviet period to begin with the image of the dispersion of Jews from a cemetery, of kicking them out from a cemetery. You would think of a cemetery as a place where stories end. To me, this is a really weird way to begin a story, right? So what does it mean that the story that I'm telling in this book and the story that Babel tells us about 1919 begins not with the end, or begins with the end that is the beginning. So the elderly Jews who continue living, but it's unclear where they go. And he kind of compares them to the heap of rags. So I started to think about kind of what does it mean? And I came to think of this gruda lachmotiev, this heap of rags, not as a pejorative term, but rather a shorthand for the collection of habits, practices, and cultural tropes associated with the defunct Russian Empire's Ashkenazi Jews that were appended by the revolution of 1917, but did not remain behind and die off in the old world. So instead, personal characteristics, worn-out possessions, disaggregated bits of culture, and uprooted customs carried on across the landscape of the Soviet experience. And along the way, these habits of culture encountered and were modified by the ideological messages of the new Soviet state and various structural pressures of that state. And so the Soviet Jew, of the title of my book, this layered and determined and fluid figure that emerged from this alchemy, as it were, remained in perpetual motion. So I tried to tell the story of that figure and to outline that figure's contours. So I want to talk about sort of how I do this, and I'll talk about sort of different moments, a kind of almost like a recipe, if how the Soviet Jew was made was a recipe book, right? What are the components that go? I have 5 components that I'll talk about, and I'll sort of particularly highlight the ones that have to do with Ukraine. But I wanted to kind of begin telling that story with a map. This is a map that's in the book. and it was a map that I worked on with a map maker. I don't know how to make maps, but I approached a map maker, and it was a really kind of difficult thing to explain. And I'm really grateful for this. If you need a map maker for your book, I have a good one to recommend, because what it is a map of space, of time, space, but also time. What I wanted to show is the story that I'm telling, the story about 1917 to roughly 1939, and I'll tell you why that is the story after the Pale of Settlement that Marina Badana talked about at the beginning of the talk a couple of weeks ago, the place where Jews were restricted by residents in the imperial period in the western borderlands of the Russian Empire ceased to exist in February of 1917, which meant that the provisional government that came to power after the abdication of the Tsar granted Jews civil rights, equal rights in the polity that was kind of emerging from under the ruins of the Russian Empire. And so there was no longer any restrictions. And the Pale of Settlement was where most Jews in the Russian Empire had lived for, 120 some years, 130, I'm bad with math, but over a century, where kind of unique habits formed, literature, when Yiddish emerged, kind of ways of life. So I'm trying to think about how in this period of 20 years or so, the Pale was no longer there, but it carried on, as it were, and were disaggregated into other spheres of Soviet culture, like those people leaving the cemetery that Babel had written about. So what I try to do here, in the kind of shaded, the darker color that you see on the big map, is the outlines of the Pale of Settlement before 1917, but they're superimposed onto the map of the Soviet Union that was established in 1922, but also post-World War I nation states, right? So the Polish state of Poland, the independent Polish state, it's Romania, etc., states that didn't exist prior to the end of World War I. And then the highlight that you see on the insert is the kind of close-up of that area of the Pale of Settlement that in this kind of, you can see this more clearly on this map, where I put this yellow line that divides the borders of the Soviet Union from the borders of new states, Poland especially, that hadn't existed before. And what you see when you look at this kind of map is that something that was part of a more contiguous universe now becomes placed into different political environments, which causes the creation of different subjectivities, but also of different stories that can begin to emerge about how the two continue to interact in various ways. And so when I kind of think about the map as a key to the book, so I'm trying to tell the story of the dispersion of the Pale, the end of the Pale, but its continuation in some kind of presence, as a presence into the Soviet period. I think about the time frame of 1917 to the end of the interwar period, 1939, for a couple of different reasons, right? One has to do with the map itself, right? This map will change one more time in 1939, 1940, right? With the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when Nazi Germany will invade Poland, right? And the Soviet Union will invade Poland from the other side, but also will annex the Baltic states in 1940, also parts of Romania in 1940 as well. And things will change one more time dramatically at the onset of the Holocaust. So that's it. It's not a different story, but it's yet another story to tell, right? But in this book, I wanted to really think about of what happens before that story. So that's why the sort of the first 20 years of the Soviet period. And I'm also thinking about kind of the productive years. Those are productive years for me to think about because I can think about them across two languages. And the two languages that I work with are Russian and Yiddish. And in this case, about half the book is about material that's in Russian, but half the book about this material that's in Yiddish. These are not the only two languages, obviously, right? Of course, Ukrainian is also spoken, Belarusian is also spoken, but I'm thinking about Russian as the language of the Soviet state, right? That exerts a particular kind of pressure, pull, attraction onto what's happening. And I'm thinking of Yiddish as the native language for most of the Jews who come into the Soviet period and into the Soviet polity at that point. And there's a vibrant sort of culture in those two languages that begins to think about, among other things, about what it means to be Jewish in the Soviet period. So kind of that's why I'm sort of attracted to this. The various place names on this particular map are very idiosyncratic to what I talk about in my book. And the spelling, this is always controversial. Whichever way you decide to do it is wrong. The decision here has to do with, there's no right way to do this, right? The decision here was to go with Russianized Russian language spellings in the part of the map that falls under Soviet control, right? Because if you do it in various languages, it will be too many languages for one map. You have to follow Belarusian spellings for things that are in Belarus. You have to follow Ukrainian spellings for things that are in Ukraine, and to follow other spellings for things that are in Poland, right? So it's kind of easier to figure out how to do that, even though they have different spellings today. But that's what I have to explain, that this was a conscious decision. There's not an easy way to do this, and people can talk about maps for a long time. So let me kind of think about. I mentioned that there are kind of 5 main sort of central elements to what I think this figure of the Soviet Jew is, that I see as a new figure that's kind of emerging at this point. And I'll talk about each of them, and I'll kind of remind you what the previous ones were, because I'll go on these tangents with each one, more or less with some of them, to kind of take you through some of the material that I worked with. I'm a literary scholar and a scholar of film. I'm not an historian, but I try to kind of think as a cultural historian. And each of my case studies center on a literary text or a film, often just one, sometimes a few, but kind of always quite a limited number that I try to kind of read closely. But it doesn't mean that that's all that I do. I try to kind of dive into various other materials around those texts, often extra literary, various kind of historical documents, but also other literary texts, and to kind of try to piece together these 5 elements, as it were. So kind of the first ingredient, right? The first element has to do with pogroms, of the violence of what is often called the Russian Civil War. Not necessarily the best descriptor. Historians argue about that word, but the violence that sort of follows the revolution of 1917, it's post-revolutionary violence, or maybe revolutionary violence, that goes on. And at this point, we're talking mainly about Ukraine. It happens elsewhere as well, but what's relevant to my story, the story that I'm telling is Ukraine in the years between 1918 and 1921. And my guide to this part of the story is a novel by a Yiddish writer born in Ukraine, in a shtetl in Ukraine, in Nakhimovo in Ukraine, near Kiev, David Bergelson, born in the 1880s, established as an author by 1920, published his very famous works by then. And I'm thinking, with the help of his novel that I translated together with Harriet Murav, which in our translation we call Judgment, or it's called Midas Hazin. So those of you, Sheila knows Hebrew, some of maybe others know Hebrew, you know Hebrew, right? So you can tell that there's something going on here, and I'll talk about this kind of publication history in a bit. So I want to take you through kind of what I try to do with looking at this novel, but also how I do this, right? So kind of for those of you who are students, if this is kind of interesting about how to do research. This novel is set in a fictional town called Gelichovka, which doesn't exist, but it's set on the border between, it's 1920, and we're on the border of Ukraine that the Bolsheviks are controlling in that part of the border, but very tenuously in the novel. And just across a forest is Poland. And see, I kind of put that part of the map with this yellow border. This border is porous, right? And it had been, the soul had been part of the same polity, and now it isn't, which means that this is great for creation of plots, right? They're smugglers who go back and forth across the border, and they're smugglers of all sorts of things. They're smugglers of goods, they're smugglers of people who are trying to flee, but also smugglers of political literature and smugglers of the kind of counter-revolutionary trends. So there's all this kind of movement back and forth across the border. What you see on the left, this is an article from 1925 from 30 dnей, 30 days, this sort of really important Soviet monthly, literary monthly, but also kind of culture monthly, with an article about smuggling, about Shepitovka or Shepitivka in contemporary Ukrainian. So, and I have it mapped on my map as maybe what Bergelsen is really thinking about, right? Something that sounds similar, but it's also the same kind of border situation. So it's a novel about borders. It's a novel about crossing borders. And I try to think about kind of how Bergelsen came to tell that story, given where he was at the time. So in all of the ways that I approach literature, I try to think about where it was written and what were the kind of material conditions of how it was produced and where it was produced and what else was going on at the time when this came out. So David Bergelsen in 1921 relocated to Berlin, as did many other Yiddish writers, Hebrew writers, Russian language writers, some Ukrainian writers. Berlin became a place where lots of refugees from the violence of Eastern Europe had kind of fled to. He already left Ukraine in 1918, kind of in the midst of the violence, sending his pregnant wife first to Moscow, but then they moved to Berlin. So Berlin is a really interesting place at the time. It's very cheap to publish things there because of the inflation. So there is this boom in publishing, in Hebrew language publishing, in Yiddish language publishing, but also in Russian language publishing, right? So this kind of vibe, they're not always overlapping circles, right? Some people have done different kind of studies of that interwar period. So Bergelsen starts a journal, as I think everybody did, in Berlin in 1926, in Spann, which means in harness. The only 2 issues of that journal would come out. So he himself edits it. And in the first issue of the journal, he has 2 articles, two items. So the one that's highlighted in red is Midas Hadin, this chapters from this new novel that he's writing about the smugglers. And then in blue is also by him this programmatic essay that he writes called Drei Zentren, or 3 centers. So to me, the appearance of these 2 things side by side is really interesting. So here is just the pages from this issue, kind of side by side, Midas Hadin at the top, and then Drei Zentren. So in Drei Zentren, in this programmatic essay, Bergelsen tries to think about what it means to be a Jewish writer in the Soviet Union, where he's not living at the time, right? But he's sort of trying to think about it in a way that would be somewhere that he would move, and he did in 1934. Right? So from 1926, he's not going to move for another 8 years. And he tries to imagine how somewhere in the Soviet Union, on the steppes occupied by Jewish farming villages, somewhere at the factory or in the workshop of the Jewish craftsmen, the new Jewish artist is already ripening. The song of Jewish labor and self-sacrifice for world liberation. This will be the content of new Yiddish book he will write, and this will be the content of the new Jewish art in Soviet Russia. So he's kind of in this sort of lofty terms, right, thinking about the revolution. But then he goes on, right, kind of thinking about what it is that the Jewish artist, and he means Yiddish in this case, right, would have to grapple with. What about the destruction of the Jewish majority who are deeply affected by the declining Jewish shtetlich that have been shoved out of their economic position by the new way of life? Right? What about the pogroms that just took place? What about the new economic regime that makes a lot of the economic life of the old shtetl, old town where Jews could live, completely inadequate in the and sometimes illegal, right? Trade, things like this. Certainly, the new Jewish artist will also see destruction around him, unavoidable destruction crying to the heavens. The full severity of the law, Midas Hadin, right, or Midat Hadin in Hebrew, the title of the novel, but also a rabbinic concept, about judgment, right? About the full severity of judgment. The road of social justice, poverty, need, fearful cries of woe against violent death, all this, but with the perspective of a new young regeneration with a more assured hope of a steady, slow, perhaps very slow renewal. So he uses in his programmatic essay, imagining the task of the writer in the Soviet Union, he uses the same words, same concept that he uses for the title of his novel, that he's writing in the same issue of the journal, begins to publish in the same issue, trying to think about what that would look like. So what does it look like? The novel kind of, he serializes it. I'm very interested in serial publications. Whenever there are serial publications, it means that you can find them printed in issues of journals where other things are printed, and you can try to figure out, deduce kind of broader context. But in this case, you could also deduce something else, right? So here is a Jewish Yiddish writer from Ukraine in Berlin, thinking about the Soviet Union and writing a novel about the revolution, but where is it getting printed? All over the place, right? So he published chapters of it wherever there were Yiddish periodicals, more or less. Also, you get paid honoraria for publications. So this is chapters of this novel in Stern, which is a journal in Minsk, right? In the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, which is a really important place because Yiddish there is one of the 4 official languages in the interwar period, along with Polish, Belarusian, and Russian. And also houses several important Yiddish language institutions. He publishes chapters of it in New York. This is the Oifkum, right? So chapters in New York. And you can see, if you can follow the spellings, you can see the Soviet orthography versus Hebrew language orthography, sort of standard. This is Hebrew, right? This is Soviet kind of phonetic orthography, if you can see the difference. And then coming back to Ukraine, this is Geroi Welt, which is published in Kharkiv, which it becomes an important center also of Yiddish culture. So this is a novel of imagining the Soviet Union, yet written by a writer who is in exile from Ukraine in Berlin, thinking about the Soviet Union, but it's global, right? So it's kind of really interesting to think about kind of what that does to a text. What became really interesting, so I co-translated this with Harriet Murav. Both of us also developed completely different interests in how we saw that text. So Harriet wrote a book about Bergelsen and the question of time and futurity. So this book figures there for philosophical concepts, for concepts of judgment, for concepts of the deferral of judgment. I became interested in the question of what did it mean for Bergelsen to be in Berlin in the mid-1920s and to set a novel in 1920. And the answer for me became that he was at the moment in time when he was surrounded by refugees from pogroms, from violence of the revolution. He was in a city where the awareness of those pogroms became very prominent. There were historians already collecting testimony from survivors, and they had already published it. There were publications about pogroms in Ukraine as early as 1921, right? That came out of Berlin, and they were in Russian, they were in Yiddish. Simon Dubnov, the kind of great historian of Russian Jewry, was there, kind of part of that project, but also Elias Cherkover. So there's all this kind of awareness of the violence. So he is there with people who know how the story ended, the stories to tell, right? He's writing starting in 1925. The novel comes out as a book in 1929. Simultaneously, I'll go back to the slide, in Vilna, so this is the kind of your Hebrew orthography, and in Kiev, Soviet orthography. So it's the same title, but if you don't know anything about the two languages, you can see that they look differently. There's sort of ideological underpinning to kind of changing the spelling in the Soviet system. And he writes a novel about the border and about the borderlands, in which the main protagonist is a border guard who is not Jewish. His name is Filipov, and he is a Chekist. He's a member of the Cheka, the Soviets at that point, really kind of border police, secret police, that was meant to kind of deal with counter-revolutionary activity, and he is there to enforce that, right? So this He is near a shtetl called Galichovka, which is full of Jews whose lives have been upended by the revolution, by the border. They now have to smuggle things, they have to host people who are being smuggled. So they're kind of constantly channeled into these illegal activities. And this Filipov supervises them. But there's also Filipov, the Chekist, is there to represent the Bolshevik power that had, in theory, stopped violence against Jews. Like that's kind of one big commonplace. It's not untrue in most cases, but it's not true in some others, that most of the violence against Jews was not committed by Bolsheviks. Some of it was, right? But he is there to represent the coming of order, that the violence that the Jews had experienced from white monarchists, various nationalist formations in Ukraine, various roaming bands of, hooligans, had come to an end with the arrival of the strictness of Bolshevik law, Midas Hadin. But, right, and so many, during the Cold War, Yiddishists in America dismissed this novel as a propaganda of Bolshevism, because they read that they saw this as a celebration of Soviet power. However, right, so this is what gets interesting to me. This border guard is sick and ailing. He has wounds on his neck from some unclear ailment, and he is assumed by everyone in town to be a goner. So it's a very strange representation of Soviet power to think about something that can last if you try to celebrate it. So I'm trying to think about this novel as a novel in which Bergelsen tries to imagine Jews in the shtetl of 1920 who don't know how the story ends. They don't know that Filipov was going to be there just, right? And they fear the return of violence that they had experienced, that the kind of this unsteadiness portends. And added to this is that Filipov's, looks like a monster. People see him from far away. He has this very identifiable voice, but he also is the border post of the Cheka is located in a monastery that's falling apart. So it's very Gothic. And so you have this kind of attributes of a Gothic novel. Gothic novels deal with the return of the repressed, to try to deal with the return of violence that's there to be somehow anticipated. So I'm trying to think about David Bergelsen, who also reads, I read it, oh my God, it's I made my way through this. Terrible reading, but important. He writes this novel, he writes in Yiddish, but he also reads in Russian, right? And he reads all of the texts that had already been published in the Soviet Union, or are about to be published. They're in the air, including this horrible novel from 1922, but really important, which celebrates the Chekists, celebrates the members of the Cheka. So there's already kind of a well-established genre of writing about the Cheka, and there's also an even more kind of prominent genre of novels, text, short stories about the Civil War, right? So he is not writing, he's writing in Yiddish, but he's also keeping kind of one eye towards Russian language, Soviet culture. So my kind of first ingredient is trying to think about pogroms and this anxiety about violence that may not have ended as percolating through the Soviet period. Pogroms also caused the refugee problem. So Bergelsen is one instantiation, but I'll tell you kind of more stories later as we go on. So the novel, this is kind of a fun discovery. There was a translation of it done into Russian in 1934. And at the end of the file, where there was a typed script with hand corrections, there was a rejection letter from the publisher that this was not published in Russian in 1934, which made us think that maybe it wasn't actually such a Bolshevik novel as some of the kind of Cold War critics thought that it was. So that's ingredient number one. Ingredient number two, and I'm not going to go into details here, I think about industrialization and kind of both physically but also discursively. The introduction of electricity, of movies, of the radio, that in some ways connected, people who lived in kind of far-flung places, maybe shtetls, they became part of cities, and how those discourses kind of affected the way the people thought of themselves. So in this particular part of the book, this is about a novel by Moshe Kulbach. This is about Minsk. So I'm not going to get into the details here because we're trying to think about Ukraine. But it's this really fantastic novel about a family that's living on the outskirts of Minsk. There are several generations, and they, in the novel, I'm particularly drawn to a story of a film that they go to see in Minsk in 1929. The film is not identified, but we get some ideas of what it is. It involves polar bears, explorers on icebergs, and through kind of various sleuthing, I had discovered that they probably went to see the film the same week as the electric trolley began operating in Minsk, because this was kind of covered extensively in the press, daily press, but also in the novel. They hear a bell of a tram outside of where they live, and they take that tram to the movies. So I became obsessed with like looking at the papers, and by kind of discovering the way that the papers were really touting the arrival of this electric tram, which is one of the many instances of kind of what electricity can bring to the city, and the electricity is so wrapped up with kind of the project of Soviet power that they could go see movies in the center of town. I decided to read the chronicle of what was there and realized that they went to see Nanook of the North. So those of you who are film buffs kind of know the film. If you don't, it's kind of really famous 1922 film by an American ethnographer, Robert Flaherty, about the Canadian Arctic. And it's about the Inuit. And the term that's been kind of thought about with this film is salvage ethnography, which Sheila Jung had written a book about salvage poetics, salvage, something that's sort of trying to document a culture that's disappearing, and present it as a kind of a document, even though the production of that documentation itself is wrapped up with destruction. So I'm trying to think here about the way in which these discourses of Soviet power, Soviet modernization themselves kind of created a new subject, but also were kind of very cognizant of the destruction of some kind of an old subject. So that's kind of my second point. Third ingredient, I try to think about Birobidzhan, this sort of weird place. So this is the Pale, former Pale of settlement. This is Birobidzhan. If I was showing you my actual presenter view, you would see this animated with like a pause, so I could ask you to guess where it is. But this is the Jewish autonomous region as of 1934, or just kind of a called Birobidzhan until then. A place designated by Stalin, by the Soviet regime, as a place to settle Jews because of the way that the Soviet Union understood the kind of policy about nationalities and ethnic groups, that the ethnic groups that were defined by the Soviet regime were to have a common territory and a common language, right? So Jews had a common language, Yiddish, for the Soviet regime, the language of the working masses, not Hebrew. That's a whole kind of other story. It's also really important. But no territory, because, I mean, this is like, can't put them there, right? There's Ukrainians, there are Belarusians. There were attempts to establish colonies in Crimea in the 1920s, when Crimea was part of the Russian Soviet Socialist Federation Republic. So Birobidzhan, random. So, but not so random, right? So the story that I tried to tell here, like, if I try to think about the Soviet Jew, this is so strange, right? So out there. Very few people move there, right? It's tens of thousands at most, right? So you could think about this sort of weird, bizarre sideshow. But it's not, because it's so prominent in the discourse of the time, right? That this is the home for Soviet Jews, right? So I try to think about, well, how do people who go to see it think about what does it mean to kind of be a Jew there? So the story that I started to focus on centered on this expedition in 1929 that was sent by ICOR, which was one of the kind of American, also Canadian, Western-funded Jewish settlement organization that was interested in all kinds of settlements in different places, including Argentina, but also in Birobidzhan. They sent this expedition to Birobidzhan that was to explore what it is that the Soviets had meant. And the head of this expedition was Benjamin Harris, who was the president of Brigham Young University. I never pursued this line of inquiry, but for a while I was very interested. where the Mormons also thought of this as some sort of a weird Zion, because Mormons have also kind of a very developed way of thinking about various alternative Zions. But I never kind of knew how to do this. I read about Mormon sacred geography and kind of, we didn't go there, but they were soil specialists, agronomists, but there were also two writers who were there to report on the expedition, both of them from Odessa. So Simeon Gecht is who this is by, and also Victor Fink. So this is from Огонек, the main kind of Soviet journal, a report about Americans in Birobidzhan, Americans in Birobidzhan by Simeon Gecht from 1929, and then Simeon Gecht and the other fellow that was part of this expedition, Victor Fink, both of them from Odessa, became obsessed with the subject and continued. So they continued writing about this for years and years and years. So I'm interested in this period of 1929 when they go to Birobidzhan for the first and only time, but then they publish works in subsequent years. So this is where Marina Bagna's work on children's literature was really helpful, because among the things that they write is with children's. There's a children's story. There's actually a couple. So Gecht writes, among other things, a story about a family's relocation to Birobidzhan. And Fink writes Евреи в тайге, Jews in the Taiga, which is a sequel to Евреи в поле, Jews in the Field, which is a real book that he wrote earlier about Crimea and the agricultural colonies. And another sort of important text for me is a novel by Gecht, A Ship Sails to Jaffa and Back. So this is and I'm kind of putting the part of my map about this route, right? So it's about a protagonist who goes from Odessa to Jaffa in Palestine. And most of the novel is about the Zionist colonies in Palestine and a disenchantment, growing disenchantment with them, and then the return to Birobidzhan, right? So this is the ideological story that needs to be told in 1936. But what I became really interested in, so that makes these things, they're really kind of ideological to read. They might seem completely kind of not worthwhile. But what became really interesting to me is how these people are trying to write about Birobidzhan, but are unable to describe anything in Birobidzhan, right? So they end up being diverted to other topics, right? They might be writing extensively about Palestine. Or Victor Fink in Jews in the Taiga, he gets 100 pages into the book, and then there's this paragraph, how the reader might be wondering 100 pages in why there's nothing about Jews so far. Because he's writing about Cossacks who end up there, Cossacks from elsewhere in Siberia, from about 1,000 miles away, who were forcibly relocated there in the 1850s, when Russia first acquired this territory in the wars with China. Right, and this is a border region that's really hard to hold on to. So they try to think about other ways to how to think about Jews through non-arrival. So to me, the figure of the Soviet Jew here is the figure that doesn't arrive to where it's supposed to have come, right? So there's sort of a place for where the Soviet Jew is supposed to be, and instead we're finding alternatives in all kinds of other places. And just kind of one last point about this, there's also a global dimension to this, which is always really interesting. A part of the book about Birobidzhan gets published in the Menorah Journal, which is kind of a main American, or one of the main American kind of intellectual journals, in English translation in 1931 in a series. This is from other issues, right? They have a running series of reports from different corners of the world, right? So I'm just giving you a sample of like what other things were being written about, including this, colonies in the Taiga. And he got really punished for this because this was very unflattering portrayal that wasn't about the success of the region for Jews. So he wrote the 1932 edition was a second edition. The first one was in 1930, and in 1932 he tried to correct, right, for what kind of got out to the West. So that's the third ingredient, and then I'll kind of quickly do the last two. I'm really interested in migration that preceded the revolution, right? So 1 million Jews, possibly more, had left the Russian Empire, right, before 1917, but some kind of well into 1924. And though many of them settled in America, right, and they're sort of the ancestors of many American Jews, but also Palestine, also other places. But in the 1930s, some go back, right, for all kinds of reasons, sometimes to visit family, sometimes to resettle because it's the Depression in America and the Soviet Union is enticing. So there are films about this figure of the returnee, figure of the Jew who left the Russian Empire, who returns to the Soviet Union. And I focus on one film in particular, but also many others, in which the question becomes, can a Jew from the Russian Empire, so like the Jews who are expelled from the cemetery at the beginning of my talk, right? So already marked by the sort of dead-end nature of the PL itself, but now doubly marked as somebody who'd also lived in the corrupted capitalist West, right? Can those two attributes be somehow amended, reversed, right? And how this person could become a Soviet Jew? And the answer has to do with construction. I won't get into these details, but it's fascinating. And this film doesn't have a clear setting in the film itself, but Peretz Markish, the Yiddish writer who wrote the screenplay for the film, wrote a novel based on the film 2 years later, in which it's set in Kharkiv, which wasn't in the Pale of settlement, right? It's near the Pale, but Kharkiv becomes a site where the Jew who returns to the Soviet Union relocates after first coming to his shtetl and then moving to a construction site in Kharkiv. Right, so this is complicated, but it has to do with the thing too. And then my kind of last ingredient has to do with Yiddish folklore, in the way that Yiddish folklore can be deployed into the Soviet experience as a way to not tell a story only about Jews, right? So one way to kind of think about Yiddish folklore is preserving some sort of Jewish uniqueness that can tell something about Jews. But I'm interested in how it also becomes a kind of a cipher for telling several other stories from the early Soviet period. My guide here is Isaac Babel, the writer with whom I started, the Russian language writer from Odessa, and in particular, his interest in Hershel Astropodia, a trickster from Yiddish folklore, which could have begun anywhere, right? There are stories about this figure that were very extensively told, but I'm very drawn, I try to find something that's plausible. So I try to imagine that on his grandmother's shelf, his grandmother was important in his reading habits. Maybe this book could have been found. There are many chapbooks with Herschel. So this is one of the many that was published in 1895 in Warsaw, which was also in the Russian Empire, but on behalf of a publishing house in Odessa. So if you read the Hebrew, right, it's Hakim Blatnitsky Beodessa. Right, so this is the kind of publishing house is based in Odessa. The story that Isaac Babel adapts in Russian, and then my claim is that he goes on to write about this figure in many other stories through the rest of his career. And the figure of Herschel becomes for him a guide to the destruction of Petrograd after the revolution, which he kind of thinks about Odessa, about the 1920 war with Poland, where he thinks about the destruction of Jewish life in Western Ukraine. And also about the 1930s, various ideological fights in the 1930s that have to do with atheism, that have to do with circumcision, but also have to do with collectivization and Holodomor. Right? So he also kind of begins to think about Ukraine through the figure of the Jewish trickster. And kind of to return to my map, this is where all of these little shtetls in Ukraine become important to the itinerant trickster who walks this very bizarre, circuitous routes in the folkloric stories about him that become really important for Bible, as he himself ends up traveling some of those routes in 1920. Do I have time for a family story? What's the?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll finish with I'll go back to this is I didn't tell you about the cover, right? So the sort of coming back to this, right? I try to think about this kind of 5 main components. And I love the cover that sort of ended up coming out here. I didn't find this image myself. I suggested all kinds of images that the editor rejected, but they found this photograph about which very little is known, but a lot can be deduced, right? So So what can be deduced is that this is, and if you have a book, it kind of wraps around. There's more of it on the back. It's a hat makers collective, Artiel. They're in Skvira in Ukraine, because that's what it says behind them, right? There's the Skvira kind of town of Skvira. And it's some kind of, again, this is partially obscure, but the Pamoga, right? So there's something about, I mean, my sense that it's a fundraising effort, possibly for refugees, right? This is probably 1922 or so, 21, 22. They're raising funds, they're posing clearly. There's a little Lenin up there, right? But subtle, not the kind of red banner that you had in the beginning. And then there's also a poster in Yiddish, right? That I also can't read fully, but it's Ratten Macht, right? So Soviet power, right? I can kind of make out just enough to figure out what it is. And, you know, there were the tools of trade. And Gabriela Safran, a colleague, a friend, a mentor, I asked her, like, I asked various people, what do you think should be on the cover? There should be a picture of a Soviet Jew making something. So like, there's something here, right, essentially. But here is, I'm going to kind of finish with a story that's not in the book. And a story I didn't know while writing a book, but that I became aware of about a year ago, and started thinking about how the book that I wrote, it's very cerebral, right? It's the stories that I tell, but they're based on literary sources, film, sources, and I try to establish this typology of a Soviet Jew as a kind of a cultural figure. How I started seeing glimpses of it in the family story that I didn't think about, didn't know about. So I'll try, and I'll map it to some of the things that I told you. So about a year ago, I was giving a book talk in Portland, Oregon. And in Portland, I have relatives who are American Jews, second generation. They're in my mother's generation, but a bit older. And there are 4 siblings who are in their 70s and 80s, who are grandchildren. Okay, this is going to be hard, but not so hard. They're grandchildren of the oldest brother of my mother's great-grandmother. So my great-grandmother was the youngest of 8 siblings, born in Trstenets near Vinnytsia in Ukraine. And her oldest sibling and the second oldest left the Russian Empire in 1912, in 1914, right? 6 remained in Ukraine, and 2 of them went and ended up in Portland, Oregon at some point. The first went to Saskatchewan, which is also an interesting story because there were attempts to bring farmers or people who could claim to be farmers to Canada from Ukraine. So I was staying with these relatives whom we discovered in the 1980s, and I reconnected with them after I moved to Seattle because it's close. So I was staying with Jack, one of them. I don't have a picture of him, but he's 73. He was wearing a t-shirt that said, "I am a Ukrainian." Right, so this was 2022, right? So he was kind of beginning to kind of think about that part of their heritage also, because that part of their family did come from Ukraine. So this was also kind of very interesting, but that's how he greeted me. And then we were looking at various things in their family archive. And this is where I realized that this is such a bizarre global story. So one of his older siblings had this picture hanging in her house. And like my jaw dropped, because I'd never seen it before, right? But I knew, on the back it said 1936, right? But I knew that this photo was taken, far in Russia, because that's where I'm from, and I'll tell you that story in a sec. But that it also had, this is my great-grandmother, Mira. Right? So she was born in 1910, so she's 26. This is her mother, Miriam, right? And some of the other people are her siblings. I'll show you them. Most of them are her siblings. Some of them are spouses of the sibling. But it's this guy that became a big question for me, because this was the other sibling, not the grandfather of my relatives, but his younger brother, who also went to America. So who left in 1914. So I'm like, what is going on? Why is he, who had been in America for 20 some years, in 1936 in the Soviet Union? So this is where, and I'm going to kind of model the research process that I also do with my literary texts, and except in this case, I had to turn to Ancestry.com, which I never could use before because I didn't have any relatives who interacted with the kinds of bureaucratic spheres that end up on Ancestry.com, which is American immigration, etc. So, so here is kind of how that story works, as far as I can put it together. So this is where they were from, right? This is where my grandmother was born in 1910. And they ended up there, right? This is, Google Maps, walking directions. Google doesn't give you other directions now because of the war, right? You can't take a car across, right? So I'm borders again, right? With borders for different reasons. But very, very, very far away. This is in the Ural Mountains. And it's not clear why they ended up there specifically, because they were there. I didn't know when they ended up there. I always thought that it had to do with the Second World War, because that's a common story. The Jews from Ukraine, Jews from Lithuania would end up in the Soviet interior in 1941, except that also in the family archive, I found this. My relatives in Portland had these photographs that had something on the back of them. So this is the two other sisters of my great-grandmother who wrote a postcard to their brothers in America in Russian, right? That was 1918, right? So I knew that they were in Ufa in 1918, which was very bizarre, right? So, so kind of how do they end up there, right? Becomes kind of a big question for me. Right. I don't know, right? But this is after the revolution. There is a big pogrom in Trosteniec in 1919, right? And this is from Elisa Bemporad's book about the violence after the revolution, with the memorial already from the time to the victims of the pogrom. Maybe they had a sense somehow that things were going badly and left before the real violence started. Or it could be, and this there's no way of verifying, that they had relatives already in Ufa who were Cantonists. And this could be a common story. There's no way in which I can verify this, who were Jewish soldiers in the Russian Imperial Army who were recruited for 25 years. And if they survived their term of service and were still Jews or identifying as Jews, they could settle outside the field of settlement. No way to verify the story unless I figure out which archives to use, but this is like something that was mentioned to me. This is my Portland relatives' grandparents on their wedding day in Kakhovka in Ukraine, which you now know from the flooding of the Kakhovka Dam, right? So this is sort of Kakhovka, right? So this is from a studio in Kakhovka. So his name was Misha Zugman. So this was left for him, Misha Zugman, right? And then this is their American-born mother had sort of identified it in English. So the question for me then is, so this guy is in America in 1912. His brother Peter is in America. He becomes Peter, Pinchas, becomes in America. He comes to America in 1914. What was he doing in the Soviet Union earlier? So then I'm kind of interested in various other interactions between the Soviet Union and this family already in Ufa, but they're from Ukraine. So something else that my relatives have is this picture of my great-great-great-grandparents, right? So this is my great-grandmother's parents posing for a photo. This is clearly a studio photo. I don't know what's going on here. People who study photography have really, nobody knows, right? This weird, what is happening, right? Why is he putting his hands like this on her shoulders? But what the story that they tell me is about this, that this was a parcel that their American children had sent to them, right? Already not to Ukraine. They were already not in Ukraine, outside Ukraine, and that they took the parcel to the photo studio to take a picture with it and then send this picture. And this picture is hanging in Portland, Oregon. Right, so the message made it back, right, that the parcel was received. So these connections are really interesting to me, right? So these people become Soviet Jews, but they have this other branch, right, with whom they're interacting at this point, which then takes me back to this photo, right? So, and I'm thinking about who is absent from this photo. So the ones who are in blue circles are the siblings. In the hexagon is Peter, also the sibling from America. And my question is, why is he there? Yellow is their mother, and absent are some others who my mother kind of helped me think about why, and their father, right? The man in this photograph. And then I had a theory, right? Then I kind of realized what was going on, which had to do with the American documents. So then I have ship manifests putting Peter Zugman, right? He's on a ship from New York to Portsmouth, England, right? This is a ship manifest arriving in Portsmouth, England, or Plymouth, sorry, on May 16, 1936. He lists his destination as Ufa, O-U-F-A, Revolutionная, which is the street where my mother grew up later, Revolution Street, in the USSR. So this is May 16th. This is his father's grave, May 14th, 1936. Right, so he probably he didn't make it to the funeral. Right, that he was probably summoned to the deathbed, right? And sort of came late, and that this picture must have been taken during that trip because I have him coming back to Ellis Island, right? And this is July 8th, right, 1936, right? And there he is, living in Detroit. So kind of coming back, and let me kind of wrap all this up, right? Kind of the story that I try to tell, right, is trying to kind of think about Ukraine in this case, right, but also other parts of the story and how they become kind of universalized into the sort of Soviet experience, and how the Soviet Jew comes to be as a figure with these various geographies. All right. Thank you. Sorry, I talked for longer than I should have, but I'd love to take questions.
To facilitate questions yourself, or do you need me to come up?
Whatever works. If there's Zoom also, I don't know how that works.
That's a good question. Are there any questions on the Zoom that you can see, Sia? There is. Okay. So if the Zoom people have questions, please drop them in the Q&A. And we'll start with the questions here. Does anyone here have any questions that they'd like to ask?
Okay, so Sasha, I am thinking about your beginning, in the beginning of the book and the chronology of the book. And my first question is, you start with the pogroms of the Civil War, right? Why not the Kishinev pogrom? Why not 1881?
So the Soviet Jew, right? I'm really trying to. So Karen returned the book about the First World War really helpful, right? Because there's a breaking point, but it also is not a breaking point, right? So I'm very interested in the Sovietness, right? And then I'm interested in how the Pale disaggregates and continues. So that part is the continuity, right? So I'm interested in tracing various continuities, but I'm really interested in the Sovietness, right? So not and that already, right? The book so this is really interesting how the period can begin to expand with how you tell the story.
Yeah.
So Sheila started the introduction with the point of encounter, the Cold War era, right? And I'm already trying to limit myself to the 20 years there. And that is already proving to be not sufficient, right? From your question, but also in general, right? So it's just sort of interesting to think about how to tell that story.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there are other accounts of violence, right? So Jeff Weidlinger has a book on pogroms of the Civil War, but he talks about the violence that preceded it, but it also frames the pogroms of the Civil War as a kind of antecedent of the Holocaust, because it also concerns some of the same territory, but it goes back, right, thinking about the violence that had preceded 1918, 1919, 1920, 1921. But that's why, right? To me, that was, I wanted, in my scholarship, I'm interested in translation. I'm really interested in what is a Soviet Jew, and in some way, this for me was sort of part one of maybe what needs to be written to try to really start with the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, and just a very side remark, your relatives in Ufa definitely didn't enjoy the visit of the American relative in 1936.
Probably was, well, right, but Ufa is also different, right? So not a center of anything.
Moscow is another.
Right, so I think that maybe was, like, no one, as far as I know, suffered for it,
Okay.
right? And maybe it helped that they were in the periphery, right? Ufa becomes oddly this like more important place during the war because lots of people moved there during an evacuation. So all kinds of kind of famous names end up there, which I didn't know growing up, and I only knew from studying this period later. Dolores Sibaruri was in Ufa, right? Because the Comintern radio was based in Ufa. I had no idea until a couple of years ago. David Hofstein, the Yiddish poet from Ukraine, right? He was in Ufa. And some scholarship has recently come out about some of the things he wrote in Ufa. So it's like one of these very far-flung places that you don't think of as kind of part of the major. But when you think about how people there are really from somewhere else, but then you can see the continuities with the Ukrainian story, with the Lithuanian story, whatever. So other parts of my family for Ukraine. Yeah.
So I wanted you to, I have a lot of things to say, but I'll say some of them at dinner. But I wanted you, for the sake of the students here, to elaborate a little bit more on the different orthographies that you pointed to.
Yeah.
And also I wanted you to talk a little bit about the fate of some of these writers in 1952.
Yeah, so great questions. So kind of the basic, there are many ways to kind of think about how to spell Yiddish, right? Yiddish is the Germanic language that uses Hebrew script. It had not been systematized in any way, really, for a lot of the time that it was written. So if you look at editions of Yiddish, right, Shalom Aleichem from the 19-teens, they're in like, they seem very German because there was a convention of adding all these letters that made it sound sort of Germanish, that then got axed when it was kind of standardized. So the one standardization is the YIVO Institute that opens in Vilna in 1925, the Jewish Scientific Institute, or the YIVO Institute for Jewish Culture, that now exists in New York, but began in Vilna. So they systematize YIVO, the spelling. So this is Vilna, and Yiddish has, I don't know, 20%, it's hard to estimate, of its lexical kind of vocabulary is from Hebrew. And often, but not only, its connections to Jewish custom, religious life, concepts that derive from kind of the Jewish liturgical sphere, but not only, because sometimes they also change their meanings and mean something else in Yiddish. So in YIVO orthography, they get spelled according to the same way that they're spelled in Hebrew, right? As they could be found, let's say, in the Bible, or as they could be found in some liturgical texts. And they maintain the same spelling, but they're pronounced not the way that you pronounce modern Hebrew today. It's Ashkenazi pronunciation of Hebrew, which people now think of as Yiddish, but really was not thought. It's complicated, its own sort of different rhythm. So if you were reading it in modern Hebrew, you would read this Midat Hadin. In Yiddish, you would read this as Midas Hadin. So Soviet Yiddish is phonetic, right? So this is what it says. This is Midas Hadin. It adds phonetic letters to spell this connection. And this becomes really interesting and I write about this a little bit in the book. You could think about this conceptually on multiple levels. On one level, it severs the connection to Hebrew, right? So which is ideologically important for the Soviet period, is that you cannot visually identify the connection to concepts that especially come from, this is a Talmudic concept, right? That has to do with ways in which one can approach a legal case, whether it's a measure, you can approach it with a measure of severity or a measure of compassion. Doesn't translate well into kind of.
And this one is the severity.
This is the severity of the law, right? So you could translate it as the full severity of the law. This is how it's mentioned in other texts. We decided to go with judgment, right? As sort of one word title. Also, it's published in Berlin in begins to publish in 1925. Kafka's their process comes out in German, right? So there's a sort of a resonance to also other stories, the gazettes, etc. So that's orthography. Second question was about the fate of the people. So fate of the people. So, and I write about this in the book as well, right? So it depends, right? So most people I write about don't make it out alive, right? Or don't die their natural deaths. So Moishe Kulbak, the author of a novel about Minsk, is executed in 1937. And it's kind of really fascinating to think about kind of how to think about his death. I don't write about this in the book, but I came to understand this later. But it has to be also very specific, regionally specific. So you can think about 1937 as this big dark year that people tend to think about as in a very monolithic way. But he was in Minsk, right? And he was involved, he had come to Minsk in 1926, and he lived before that, he lived in Vilna, which was Poland. And before that, he lived in Berlin. And he became known as a poet in Vilna, so the connections in Vilna. Vilna is only today 4 hours away from Minsk, but the border is very, very close, right, between Poland at the time, because Vilna, then now it's Vilnius, Lithuania. So Vilna, Poland, and Minsk in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic are very close. So in 1937 in Minsk, people like Kulbak would have been suspect because of their connection to Poland. Right? And one of the stories that I didn't sort of say today, but I write about this in the book, the time period was also really important for me of ending my book in the 1930s, because it had to do with the passport, the Soviet passport, the internal passport. The commonplace about the Soviet passport is much later. American Jews tend to think about passport nationality. The Soviet Jews had Jew written on their passport, and that made it difficult for them to be employed. But that's a later story, right? That's a much later story. The passport was introduced in 1932, and it has nothing to do with Jews. It has to do with Ukrainian peasants and with tethering peasants to the land on collective farms. If they don't have a passport, they didn't have passports. If you were on a collective farm, you couldn't be in a city and reside in the city. They add a nationality line, ethnicity line later, and the NKVD begins to enforce it really in 1937, 1938, and their concern is Poland. It's Polish spies, right? They're just because they think Poland's going to attack them, right? So that becomes kind of suspect. So Kulbak is executed then. I mean, I don't know, there's no record why he was arrested, but he was killed also on the same night as 100 other Belarusian poets and writers and intellectuals. So this is also really interesting because he has now in contemporary Belarus, especially in the kind of underground liberal opposition to the Lukashenko regime, become part of the Belarusian culture, right? So somebody sent me, Wojcina Mort, the Belarusian poet who lives in the US, sent me a book of complete translations of Moshe Kulbak's poetry into Belarusian, published last, right? So he's been kind of recovered as a figure of, so that's one story, right? Isaac Babel is arrested in 1939 and killed in 1940. Lots of people have written about the Babel's case, right? And its all bizarreness and it's everything from, accusations of being English spy, I think was in his case, was the two possibilities that he was romantically involved with the wife of the NKVD chief who was himself purged a year earlier. Like there's all kinds of, right? There's every story is really unique, right? So Yizhov, Yizhov was purged by that, right? So he was, who knows, right? So there's people have written about this. Bergelsen is killed in 1952, as is Peretz Markish, right? Who's the author of the screenplay. And they are arrested in 1949, so after the war, as members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee that set up during World War II in 1941 to kind of advocate for Western support for the Soviet war effort, but specifically among the Jewish kind of communities. So they're appealing to donors, etc. They're kind of the people who get sent to the US. So there's a delegation that comes to the US in 1943. They meet with Einstein, in Princeton, right? So there's a sort of interesting story. But then after the war, this is the beginning of the Cold War already, right? Stalin grows suspicious of people with foreign connections. Jews become cosmopolitans, right? That becomes a dirty word. And there's that's the explanation for that. So like it's no universal. And I think the other point is that it's other people made this point. David Schneer in his scholarship made this point. Other people who've studied this period, that if we begin that story with its end, we might be blinding ourselves to understanding that period on its own terms. Right? That if we kind of start with their deaths, it assigns the kind of its ideology as though it had to happen that way. But maybe it didn't, maybe they didn't know, right? I'm kind of interested in trying to not avoid that. That's in my book, I read about the end, but I'm trying to kind of think about what they were thinking about and with at the time that they were writing their stuff.
Right, because they didn't know their own.
Well, I don't know what they knew or guessed or not, but I'm interested in the kind of the specificity and the rootedness of these works that I'm talking about in the times that they were published, and to try to understand the kind of discourses that they were themselves participating in.
Sia, I think there's a question in the Q&A. Would you mind?
And maybe one in the chat too, then.
Yeah, we're running out of time, so I think
Oh, do you want me to? Do you want me to do this?
we can just pull it up.
Sorry, I don't. Is it the chat?
There's a
Oh, that's
Q&A in the
you.
chat.
Somebody is zooming in from Australia, but I can't read it.
You're right there as well.
Oh, thanks for a great talk. Apologies, this was covered. I'm zooming in from Australia. Hello. Down under. Soviet Jewish identity is clear, distinct, but also time-stamped now. What distinctions do you see between Soviet Jewish identity, culture of Jewish people who grew up in the Soviet Union versus Jewish people who have grown up in the Russian Federation or other ex-Soviet nations? Is Soviet Jewish culture preserved, albeit nostalgically in diaspora? Right, in Beach, Brooklyn, for example. Also, can you speak about the Chobot? Okay, that's a separate question. So the first question, really interesting question. So when I first when my book came out in 2022, the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion had begun. The book was already in press when that started. I asked my editor whether I could still write some kind of a preface, and that I couldn't do it. And I don't know what I would have written, but somehow there was an urge. And then I realized that it's fine. I actually I'm very careful I don't talk about Russian Jews, I talk about Soviet Jews, right? Because it became clear to me why I myself was uncomfortable thinking about Russian Jews as opposed to Soviet Jews. So this question is, someone asked me a question at my first book talk: how can your book help us understand Zelensky? Right? And I mean, it's a weird question, but it's actually kind of an interesting question. Right? So I mean, first I'm like, what are you talking about? But then I'm like, because there was this interest in Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. There was already coverage of his Jewishness. People became interested in this. So I think there's an interest in, and we're talking about a kind of a prehistory, right, of how this period of the 20s and 30s would then, what happens to this stuff during the war, right, during the Second World War and the Holocaust, but also then afterwards. And I don't think I have a clear answer yet, but I think this is what I may be doing next, right? So I think it requires, I mean, I can speculate, right? And I can have anecdotal stories, but I can tell you what I'm sort of trying to, so I'm together with Harriet Maravigan, we're translating stories published after 1945 in Yiddish and in Russian that deal with the Holocaust, because we want to understand, published in the Soviet Union, not hidden, right, out in the public, but not known to people, because we want to try to understand what were the parameters of thinking about the Holocaust in the Soviet Union that existed, right? Because the common story, but not, see, zero is what we think, but not when we read the literature, right? We need to understand something else that I didn't know before I began translating this text from Yiddish, right? They were also translated into Russian in some cases, right? So I'm trying to understand how the Soviet Jew that I'm mapping out enters the war and the Holocaust, right? And then the trauma of the war and the Holocaust is another rupture, right? And then try to think about what happens later. So people who have already written about this, Jeffrey Weidlinger has a book, not the Pogrom's book, but the book about the Soviet shtetl He writes about Ukraine. The book is from maybe 2013. In the book, he's an historian, but the book is also based on oral histories gathered in the 1990s and the 2000s in the Ukrainian countryside with elderly Jews who returned to the shtetl after the war. Right? Very few, but they lived, they existed. Right? So he's trying to think about these various ruptures of the Soviet period. Anna Sternches has a book from 2006 called Soviet and Kosher. I'm always happy to advise other people's books. And she's also an oral historian who also worked with elderly Jews in collecting their stories in the 1990s and early 2000s about their childhoods in the period that I'm writing about. Right? So people who were children in the 1920s and the 1930s get interviewed by her in their 60s and 70s. And then she writes a book about kind of the way that they understood their childhood at the time, and continued on with it, right, in their Soviet lives into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. She also has another book about the war, right, also about the kind of the Jews and the war, and also kind of the memory of that through the Soviet period. So I think that, there is a continuity, right, but there's also a rupture, right? So the rupture would have to do with a lot less Yiddish, right? There is still Yiddish, and I'm now translating stories with a colleague that are published in Yiddish after the war, but it becomes much less dominant than it was in the period that I write about, right? It doesn't have the same sort of weight, circulation to kind of the larger public as it did earlier, but also some other features. Rabinovich, I mean, that's a whole separate, I used to give a talk that was invited to synagogues and stuff. To do a talk about Soviet Jewish humor. So I have a whole stand-up routine for Soviet the hammer and pickle. That wasn't my title. Someone called it that first, but then I kind of went over this when I talk about Rabinovich, who is a typology of the Soviet sort of Jewish jokes. So. Yeah.
I think we're gonna get kicked out of here.
Okay, sorry for keeping you here.
No.
So there are books,
Yeah.
if anybody wants books.
But wait, let me just make a few announcements before you disperse. So first of all, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to see you. Oh, there you are. I was wondering where the dog was. Okay. So I just want to bring your attention to the rest of the lectures in the Jewish Ukraine series. We are having a lecture on February 21st. It's on a Wednesday evening as well, in this room at 6 p.m., just like tonight, by Marat Greenberg from Reed College, who will speak on memoirs of a Jewish district attorney in Soviet Ukraine, and it's a personal family story. We also have a talk on March 6th, another Wednesday evening, also at 6 p.m., only on Zoom, with Amelia Glazer of the University of California, San Diego, who will speak on poetic reinventions in post-Maidan Ukraine. Finally, on April 3rd, our own Raymond DeLuca will speak here in the Alumni Gallery and also on Zoom at 6 p.m. on dissent and hybridity in contemporary Ukrainian Jewish poetry and film. So I hope you'll mark your calendars. I hope you continue to come to the lectures in the series. As you can see, they're wonderful. And thank you.
Everybody, I don't want to schlep these guys. You can pay me, you don't have to pay me. I can take Venmo, I can take IOU, I can take a check, whatever. If you want to pay me, I don't know, $25.
Yeah.
Deeply discounted. One doesn't make money on books.
No.
But one buys one's own books.
At dinner, you can give me your Venmo. That's easier than trying to get change.
I won't. I need to tell me your Venmo and you have to send them.
I can tell you later.
Okay, that's.
Oh, yeah.
I'm born of double chats that fit me perfectly. Right? Where's the?
Oh, there's my phone.
I was like, no, it's timing. Yeah, why not?
Хорошо.